Good morning, good morning. First of all, I guess I should start with a bit of an apology in your programme. There's a misrepresentation there. The BBC's not the biggest broadcaster in the world, actually, but they wouldn't let me put the best, so there we are. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about outsourcing in the BBC. Happy to pick up on any particular questions you might have about our other spend areas. But let me just start with a little bit of history, because I think the history will help just set the context of where we've got to on the outsourcing journey. And it is a bit of a journey for us, a long journey, but it's and we're still on it. So here you can see it all started with a bunch of engineers back in 1922, and it was the British Broadcasting Company back then. And what was interesting was that it was technology-led. There wasn't much content about then, in 1922. And very quickly, the government realised that this sort of media thing might have an impact on the country, the culture, and everything else. So network radio was launched in 1922, and the motto, which is still there today, is, inform, educate and entertain. That's what the BBC is about. TV began in 1936, you can see there, and it's probably just worth a mention that the BBC engineers, because we did like to do everything ourselves back then, invented teletext. They invented NICAM stereo. They actually invented the technology that is enabling digital broadcasting. Colour came in 1968. iPlayer, which I guess a number of you guys might use from time to time, came in Christmas 2007. And we commenced the digital switchover in 2009, and that finished last year. So every household in the UK now receives a digital signal, and analogue was turned off the tail end of last summer. What is also interesting is BBC iPlayer there, the third most favourite UK brand in 2012, apparently. And that is interesting, and this is the source for that is YouGov's favourite brands, not the top brands, the favourite brands. So iPlayer third, two above the BBC actually as a brand, which is interesting, but still only 2% of viewing is viewed on iPlayer. So time shift viewing is still only 2% in the UK. So started moving on to some facts there. You can see that there at the top is the spend, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more as we move ahead. Our income, just over £5 billion per year. For some of you that might seem a lot, for some that might be a drop in the ocean. And 3.6 billion, the lion's share of it comes from your licence fee, so thanks very much for that. We also have other income. It's pushing up actually. 1.46 billion now comes in from selling BBC programmes and formats abroad, DVDs that you might buy at Christmas and birthdays, etc. And that figure has been pushing up year on year. In terms of the actual spend on goods and services, we're running at about 1.4 billion, and that's covering all our outsourced services. That covers all our sort of category spend, which covers everything that supports the business. And on outsourced contracts, about half of that spend, 700 million, is spent on about 14 outsourced contracts, which I'm going to tell you about in a second. 97% of people watch or listen to the BBC every week, more than 19 hours apparently. And you can see there's some still big figures going through some of the BBC services and channels. Radio 2 is the most listened to radio station in the UK, 13.9 million per day, and the most watched TV programme, certainly this century, was the opening ceremony of the Olympics. 29.7 million people watched it. still doesn't hit the dizzy heights of Morecambe and Wise back in the 70s, I'm afraid, where they clocked in over 32 million regularly. Okay, so what has actually been outsourced? Well, we've got a very strong mix of services there. You can see at the top all our transmission, which we used to do ourselves right up to the latter part of the 1990s. Transmission is all outsourced, and that's terrestrial and satellite. Not that we ever had any satellites ourselves. Even the BBC doesn't invest in launching satellites into space. And then a lot of services that support our on-air activities, technology, play-out, access services, which is things like subtitling and signing. Studios in Salford, BBC moved a lot of its services up to Salford last year. More of the core services, HR, finance, facilities, management, and those two at the bottom there, outward-facing services really, audience services, people that ring the BBC or come to see BBC shows, all that administration, etc., is outsourced. And the collection of the licence fee as well is outsourced. Those ones in red, we've recently, we've adopted a sort of a new programme of approach to getting more value out of those outsourcing services, which leads to this restructuring that I'm going to tell you a little bit more about as we move forward. So, first of all, just to get into some of the detail here, why did we actually outsource anything? Because going back to the history, the BBC did like to do everything itself, and it felt very comfortable in doing that, kept it ahead of the game. But we reached a point towards the mid to late 90s that we really did need to reduce costs significantly, not by a small measure. And we needed to do that because we needed to fund this digital age that we're all enjoying now, and switching not just our transmission, but all the infrastructure that supported programme making, and we didn't have the funds for it. So we started in 1996 with finance. And what was interesting then was that when we first outsourced finance, it cost us about £30 million per year to run it. When we outsourced it, it cost us about £21 million a year. And a few years back, we refreshed it, moved to a different supplier, moved to an offshore model, and it now costs us about £11 million per year. So not a huge amount of your licence fee goes to paying our finance people, you'll be pleased to see. So that journey started in 1996, and over a period of about 10 years, we moved that variety of services that I showed you on the previous slide, culminating in HR back in 2006. Now, we did generate some huge savings, about £700 million, a bit more than that to be honest. It's around 10%, but in some areas it surpassed 10%. It was more around 15 to 17% than the cost of doing it in-house. But what we had was no overarching strategy. We literally did, we've got to get some money, we've got to reduce some costs, let's look around the BBC, see what services we don't need to do ourselves, and chuck them out to third-party suppliers. That's kind of how it all sort of worked. So we thought, okay, money's saved, we've reduced costs, job done, we can sit back and enjoy the programmes. But it wasn't quite where we ended up. Now, the approach back then is very different to the model that we're approaching in our outsourcing activity now. Now, we saved a huge bucket of money, but actually we could have saved more, really, if we'd really pushed hard. And you'll see some of the attributes here that were embedded into some of those outsourced contracts, which meant actually there were areas of value that we weren't extracting, but frankly, we wanted a fair amount of risk to be taken on by outsourced suppliers. And we went into that knowing that we're going to be paying for a level of that risk. So we had fixed-term contracts with a lot of risk transfer around things like volume, availability, and when we outsourced our audience services, we didn't even know how many people called the BBC year on year. So our supplier, who took that on for us, their first job was to manage and quantify that volume. But interestingly, they had to take the risk of managing that volume, which they did, but it did cost us a bit of money to do that. A lot of output-based is the approach, so we very much specified, you know, we want a transmission service, please, it needs to be available all this time, but very strong contracts around what happened if that availability wasn't there. And again, you know, those risks were built into the contract, or into the costing, I should say. We used KPIs a huge amount, and to be honest, if it moved and you could measure it, it was a KPI in the contract, you know, regardless of whether it had any real meaning for us. But anyway, that was the approach. And again, I think that reflected some nervousness about how some of these services would perform in the hands of an external provider. Supply chain issues were left to the suppliers themselves, so we thought, okay, it's costing us X, you're going to charge us X minus Y, just go ahead and manage that for us. We're not really interested in your supply chain. What is supply chain? Was the kind of questions that were going around the BBC at the time. And things like exit planning. We never even thought about exiting these agreements because the focus was on saving the money and getting the service delivered. So that was the approach, and it did work. It gave us these huge savings. We got quality improvements. We were introducing service levels and KPIs into service areas that weren't there before. And there was a real strong discipline that started to emerge in the way that these services were being provided back to the BBC. So that was fantastic. But we did have to restructure because we reached a point where it served us for a few years, but then things started to change. And at the bottom of this slide here, we finished our outsourcing activity, the lion's share of it, before any of this stuff was going on. So new digital channels coming in, bbc.co.uk was, you know, felt like a bit of a novelty at the time, but it's a big site now. Second most visited in Europe, apparently. And BBC iPlayer. None of this was on the horizon when we outsourced all this stuff. So what we found was that actually 50% of our external spend was now residing in fairly inflexible long-term contracts. So when we were trying to adjust and improve based on our changing business needs, we struggled to do it because our contracts were inflexible. That heavy risk transfer that I've told you about, fantastic really, because it gave us certainty over a period of time. But also, as some of those risks emerged as being quite easily managed by the suppliers, we couldn't get that benefit back into the BBC because, not surprisingly, those guys were saying, well, we took that risk, you asked us to manage it, and if we're getting any benefit from managing that, then obviously that's down to us. Wait till you compete next time. And then we found that we couldn't really reprioritise without significant effort because what was a priority for us wasn't always for our suppliers. So changing in any significant way was becoming quite tricky for us. Some services actually were becoming core again, particularly when you start to look down in the technology area. We outsourced the whole of our technology requirements, and some of that was beginning to impact our core proposition to the audience. And what we found was we'd done the cost reduction, we saved all the money. What we found there was that we needed to really focus on the value proposition, not just cost reduction. So that all sounded very good, and in theory we thought, right, what we need to do now is focus on value, not on cost. Okay, so that sounded easy to do, but it was actually quite tricky. And to be honest, the first thing we needed to do the first steps to getting that value was we needed to actually look back inside the BBC to see how we were consuming and using some of these outsourced services. And going back to this rather ad hoc strategy of, well, do we make it or do we buy it? What we did in 2007, I set up this group called the Strategic Relationships Board, STAR Board. And the only way you can get executives in the BBC to come to a new board is to give it a real sexy name, STAR Board, so you're a member of STAR, and you have the meetings over lunch. So very quickly, STAR Board took shape, and it had one purpose. Its purpose was to manage the portfolio as one, and you know, it wasn't happening. So managing the portfolio as one set of spend, if you like, was the first step to doing that. And although we were saying to our Director General and the Management Board, well, we've got these inflexible contracts, we're also tasked with the fact that, well, actually, if we look at how we consume some of those services, we can come up with some continuous improvement programs, actually, that aren't just asking the suppliers to reduce their costs and give us some of that money that they've saved in managing risk very well for us. And that was things like standardising some of our technology. It was using our FM provider to help us reduce our energy costs in our buildings and sharing the value for that. The continuous improvement programme was due to deliver 157 million over a 5-year programme, and we got just under 100 million from that continuous improvement initiative. And we went into it on the basis that it was a stretch target, and you know, we're going to fail and we're going to succeed. And the acceptance was that, you know, let's just go for it and see what happens. And then we enshrined a very consistent governance model in the way that we managed these services. And what that meant was actually looking at the people that were managing our contracts and making sure that we had the right people. So what we found was that we had very, very good contract managers managing costs and contract compliance in some contracts. In other contracts, we had very good relationship managers who were managing relationships, but they weren't really managing the cost and controlling the contract. And what we found was that we had to move people around a bit. We needed the hard-nosed contract managers focusing on the cost management initiatives, and we needed the relationship managers focusing on the future and working collaboratively with the BBC. We began reporting to the Trust, and we said, look, this is how that £700 million is going. We're trying to improve things like risk, performance, and then ultimately, once we really got ourselves into a good shape in managing that as a portfolio, we set ourselves a task to review our strategy and do some external benchmarking, see what other guys were doing. So, what emerged from that task? Well, there were some very clear conclusions, actually. That the feeling was that there wasn't really much more that we could outsource in terms of big impact stuff. We could change scope, etc., but there wasn't really much more to outsource. We needed a clear strategy for all of our outsourcing activity. So when we moved to a replacement strategy, we needed to be joined up right across all the services. And that, I think, came as a surprise to our guys, because when you're outsourcing technology and you're outsourcing FM and you're outsourcing HR, the feeling was that actually they're completely unrelated services. And actually, when you take a portfolio approach to it, you start to get better value in the way that you replace those contracts, we found. And what we also found, because we had this rigidity, was that just renewing contracts on a like-for-like basis wouldn't work. We needed to do something different. Particularly as, in some cases, we've moved away from incumbent suppliers. In some cases, we've awarded contracts with incumbent suppliers who are providing a better service to us. And we also found our contracts were beginning to overlap, particularly in areas of facilities management and technology. And we use video conferencing a lot between Salford and London, for example. And we found our facilities supplier and our technology supplier are equally in competition, effectively, trying to provide those services to us. And we needed to plan early to replace these contracts so we could make space to transition to new operating models, so we weren't buying more of the same. So, moving forward, we reinvented our strategy, just as someone reinvented Come Dancing back in 2007. We reinvented the strategy. And what we found was when we went out to the market, when we started to bring our people together to replace these services, we wanted to focus on these 4 key initiatives, if you like. So the right packaging of services, you know, is it one big monolithic contract or is it a few smaller contracts? Do we actually need to bring some stuff in-house? So what is the right package that we need to offer to the market? And that analysis, obviously, as you'd expect, would be done in working with the market as well, very early to look at what we're trying to do. We also wanted to pull back and say, actually, look, where do we need to look for real collaborative relationships? Because frankly, everyone is expecting that all our outsourced services are collaborative when they're not. I mean, the finance service is just paying bills and invoices and stuff. It's not strategic, it's not collaborative. Our spend with our outsourced provider, Steria, is tiny compared to some of their big organisations. So it's not a collaborative contract. We pay them and they pay our invoices. And our objective is to get that as cheaply as possible. But in other areas like technology, we need more collaboration so that we can lay the foundations for some level of innovation and new thinking as those services are delivered over time to the BBC. We wanted a much more agile approach to negotiating our contracts and talk about risk and talk to the suppliers about the cost of taking on some of these risks. I mentioned the volume one in audience services previously. Well, now we have the volume risk on that. We've got that. We know exactly what the volumes are broadly. And we know the types of contacts that we have in the BBC. We've taken that risk back and we've saved a lot of money in taking that risk back. So having much more open and honest dialogue about how the contract should be positioned is giving us a lot more flexibility. And the last area there is that real focused contract management, making sure we've got the right people, managing the right types of relationships, that they're doing it consistently, and they're managing that performance element as effectively as they can. So where we've got to. Just a few examples here of where we have changed the approach to get more effective relationships. So last year we completed the collection of the licence fee contract. That cost us about £90 million a year to bring in that 3.6 billion that you saw earlier. What we found is working collaboratively with our supplier, we're moving and continue to move payment of the licence fee over to the web because it's much cheaper for us to do it. We use more targeting strategies to understand people that are more likely not to pay their licence fee, particularly at the moment. And although we've seen, obviously, in the last few years some major economic problems, the licence fee collection has been maintained, and in fact has got slightly higher than predicted through the targeting strategies with this outsource effort, which wasn't part of the original outsource. In access services, again, a very rigid service actually that's become more flexible because we're working more closely with our suppliers to use better technology to deploy things like subtitling. I'm afraid for live programs you'll still see it's a bit of a nonsense, only because when we're doing live programs, someone's speaking into a machine and that machine puts the words on the screen. So if you do want a bit of a laugh when you're watching a program, you can always turn on the subtitling. For live ones, it's pretty much accurate for recorded programs. Our world service transmission, where we operate our transmission services for world service, we're closing down some of those transmission services now. And what that means is through much more a collaborative approach with our supplier, much more transparency around the costs and the cost drivers, we're finding that we can actually track a value proposition as that service declines. So we know that as the service gets smaller, we're getting value for what's left in terms of what we're paying. And the audience services contract, again, much more effective sort of dialogue and exchanges with our audiences. So we're getting much more intelligence about what our audiences think of our programs. So what's next? We've got facilities management is in progress at the moment. We've got a competition going on to replace all our FM services throughout the UK. Technology is in planning, so if you provide technology services, we'll start looking at procuring those towards the end of this calendar year. And to follow, the latter part of next year is to replace our HR and finance services. And we're going to be looking at those things there, which I've pretty much told you about in terms of our overall approach. So, have we really done anything different, really, actually, as we push ahead? And not surprisingly, I will say that, yeah, we've done a lot that's different, actually. What we've got is a much better understanding of our suppliers' operating models, their cost drivers, etc. So although they're still taking a lot of risk around providing the service, we understand where the strain points might be and where it might be easier for them to manage their costs on our behalf. We've changed our expectation that you don't just get value through running a competition alone. Getting that transparency, talking about how you're going to manage real risks that are likely to occur during the relationship and what the cost impact of those risks would be. When change becomes a cost, and this is a particular area, particularly in those areas that support our transmission and output, is that we've found that just changing some of the resource focus means that we can do that, have a big impact on the way the service is presented to the BBC, but it has no real cost. And what that means is that we don't have all these change control notices and all this sort of process to effect a change that doesn't really have a cost impact. And that's started to really have a big impact, very positive impact on the way that we consume some of our more core services. Just to mention about KPIs, they're much better linked to success now. We don't measure it if it moves, we measure it because it actually has an impact on behaviours, either the supplier behaviour or the way that we consume the services. So contracts that had 200 or 300 KPIs, now some only have 5 to 10. And that seems to be doing the job for us. Governance is much clearer now, and we're bringing in, as far as we can, much more influence around the internal customers at the BBC and the audience themselves. So what we did find that, when we looked at our reporting, we had a sea of green against our KPIs, and the audience and the internal customers were saying the service was not up to scratch. So we're building that kind of feedback into the relationships. And things are getting better. It's not perfect. It'll never be perfect. We need to keep moving forward, but we've got a reasonable sense that we're heading in the right direction. And that's it. So thank you very much. Keep watching and listening. And if you do subscribe to Sky, all my sympathies with you. Thank you.
So we learned there that Morecambe and Wye is more popular than the Olympics, so I guess there was a bit less choice then.
Yeah.
Cool names and food gets you in with the execs, and if you want to laugh, turn on the subtitles. That was the hilarious point I picked out of that. Right, next we have a double act, Graham Copeland and Catherine Lawrence from Exchanging Procurement Services, who have a host of big name clients, including some of whom I think are in the room, Legal & General, Boots,